The scent of lilacs lingered in the air, thick with the sweetness of an early spring afternoon. In the small village of St. Mary Mead, where nothing ever seemed to change, the sudden arrival of a widow stirred the once placid air. She had arrived under mysterious circumstances, her dark veil hiding more than just her grief. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, trying to piece together the puzzle that was this woman, who carried with her the weight of something far more profound than loss. What secret did she keep beneath that veil? And why did she seem so intent on hiding it from the very people she now found herself among? Before we delve into the mystery, remember to like, share, and subscribe to join our search for the truth that lies hidden behind the widow's veil. Your support helps us uncover the stories that lie in the shadows, waiting to be told. Chapter 1. The Widow's Arrival. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the village of St. Mary Mead, the kind of soft light that made the cobbled streets shimmer faintly, as if time itself had decided to slow down. A gentle breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the sweet scent of lilacs from Mrs. Hawthorne's garden and the soft chatter of neighbors preparing for evening tea. In this peaceful haven, where life moved at a pace slower than the passing seasons, the arrival of a stranger was enough to send ripples through the fabric of the town. But when that stranger was a widow, those ripples turned to waves. The woman appeared out of nowhere, stepping delicately from a carriage that had rolled into town unnoticed until it had already stopped before the great, empty manor on the hill. The coachman gave no indication of his passenger's identity as he opened the door, and the widow herself seemed to glide out with the grace of a shadow, her black gown sweeping the dust at her feet. She was tall, slender, and held herself with an air of quiet dignity, yet her presence was impossible to ignore. The veil she wore was thick, hiding her face, but the movement of her figure, the way she carried herself with such careful composure, told a story. It was the sort of quiet sorrow that could not be easily explained, and the town knew it instinctively. The widow made her way into the manor without a word, her every step purposeful and measured, as though she had already decided what her life in St. Mary Mead would be like. The manor, once the grand home of the town's wealthiest merchant, had stood vacant for years, its windows darkened by dust and time. Now, however, it seemed to sigh in relief at the sound of footsteps within its long-forgotten halls. And so, the widow took her place in a town that had no room for strangers, a town that would soon learn that its placid surface concealed more secrets than anyone could have ever imagined. As the widow disappeared inside, the town began to stir, though not outwardly. St. Mary Mead was a place where the pace of life lulled one into a false sense of security, where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. So when something as unassuming as a widow arrived in their midst, it didn't take long for the whispers to begin. By the time Miss Marple had finished her afternoon tea, the news had already spread. No one knew who the widow was, nor from where she had come. But that didn't stop the townsfolk from speculating. Miss Marple, who had lived in the village all her life, was the only one who seemed unaffected by the flurry of gossip that spread through the town like wildfire. She knew the power of observation, how it allowed the smallest details to tell a larger, far more complex story. And it was from the quietest of moments, those where people thought they weren't being watched, that the most profound revelations often emerged. From the window of her modest cottage, Miss Marple had seen the widow's arrival, her figure hidden behind the veil, her movements too measured to be entirely natural. The woman didn't belong here, that much was clear. Miss Marple wasn't one for immediate conclusions, but there was something about the way the widow moved that suggested more than just the heavy burden of grief. It was as though she had a past she was desperate to bury, and perhaps St. Mary Mead, so quiet, so unsuspecting, would be the perfect place to do just that. But Miss Marple, ever watchful, was already calculating the next move in her mind. The widow's arrival had disrupted the rhythm of the village, and where there was disruption, there was usually a story waiting to be unearthed. As the day wore on, the town's curiosity grew, and the widow remained a mystery, her secrets tightly held beneath the folds of her dark veil. Miss Marple's mind, however, was already racing. There was no rush to unearth the widow's truth, but there was no question in her mind that one day that veil would fall, revealing far more than just a woman in mourning. Chapter 2. The Gossip's Seeds. The following morning, as the sun crept lazily across the horizon, casting long shadows across the village square, the whispers began to take root. By the time the church bells rang to signal the start of Mass, the village was already abuzz with the mystery of the widow. The cobbled streets that had been so tranquil the day before now seemed to thrum with idle curiosity. Miss Marple sat by her window, the teapot in her hand, steaming faintly as she observed the comings and goings. From her vantage point, she could see the figures of Mrs. Drummond, the baker's wife, and Miss Harris, the schoolmistress, engaged in a heated conversation, their heads bent together in that familiar conspiratorial manner that one couldn't help but notice. It was inevitable that gossip would flourish in a place as small and insular as St. Mary Mead. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was not the gossip itself. It was the manner in which it spread, like ink seeping into water, staining everything it touched. "She's hiding something," Mrs. Drummond whispered, her voice sharp with a tone of certainty. "Mark my words, she's no widow. A woman like that, so young, so composed. No, there's more to her than meets the eye." Miss Harris, ever the skeptic, frowned but didn't disagree. "I don't trust her, not one bit. Who comes to a place like this with no history, no family? And what's with the veil? A woman mourning her husband wouldn't wear that, not so close to his death." It was easy to get lost in the undertow of such rumors, and soon enough, even the village's more reserved residents began to entertain the idea that there was something more to the widow's presence than mere coincidence. The seed had been planted, and it was growing rapidly. Miss Marple could see it for what it was, a harmless curiosity quickly turned into suspicion. The townsfolk didn't see it as Miss Marple did. For them, the widow was nothing more than a puzzle waiting to be solved, a blank canvas on which they could project all their fears, insecurities, and half-formed judgments. Everyone had a theory, but none of them could prove anything beyond a feeling, an instinct that something about the widow wasn't quite right. To the townsfolk, that was enough. At the bakery, Mrs. Drummond's conversation with Miss Harris was the talk of the morning. Soon, others joined in, offering their own opinions with the conviction that only the truly idle could muster. Each story they told seemed more outrageous than the last, until the widow, once simply a grieving woman, was transformed into something darker, a figure of mystery and intrigue, a widow who had come to the village to escape some past transgression perhaps, or, as some more wild-eyed villagers speculated, a woman on the run from the law. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, she smiled to herself. She had seen it all before. The rapid spread of suspicion, the webs spun from half-formed truths. It was almost always the same in St. Mary Mead. A new arrival, a wave of gossip, and then, slowly but surely, the unraveling of a truth that had once seemed too distant to grasp. But Miss Marple wasn't moved by the whispers. She had spent decades in the village, watching, listening, quietly observing. The truth, she knew, was rarely found in the frenzy of speculation. It was always buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And this widow, with her dark veil and mysterious past, was no exception. In the afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the village square to pick up a few necessities. She moved with the quiet, unhurried pace that had become so familiar to the villagers over the years. As she passed the gossiping women, she overheard the words that confirmed what she had already suspected. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Drummond's voice was loud, more so than usual. "She's been seen leaving the manor at night, slipping in and out as if she's afraid of something or someone. What kind of widow does that?" "You tell me that." Miss Harris, with a slight frown, nodded. "It doesn't add up." "She's hiding something, that's certain." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained an expression of calm indifference. She hadn't heard enough to make any definitive conclusions, but the seeds of doubt had already been sown. All she needed now was time. Time to watch, to wait, and to listen. The village might be lost in its own web of gossip, but Miss Marple knew something the others didn't. The truth, hidden beneath layers of fear and suspicion, would reveal itself when the time was right. She only hoped that when it did, it wouldn't be too late. Chapter 3. The Discovery. The quiet hum of the village began to settle once again as the days passed, and yet Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to unfold. The widow, in her solemn isolation, had become the focus of not only the town's idle chatter, but also Miss Marple's own relentless curiosity. The rumors had only grown stronger as the widow continued her mysterious comings and goings from the manor. There was something about the way she moved, the way she carried herself in the stillness of the night, that seemed to hold a secret. It was on one of those crisp, moonlit evenings when the town seemed to be holding its breath that Miss Marple decided to act. She had observed the widow enough to know that she was rarely seen during the day, her black veil drawn tight against the sunlight. But as night fell, there was always a quiet rustle from within the manor, the sound of movement, of life behind those darkened windows. It was then that the widow's pattern shifted, becoming less predictable, less in keeping with her grief-stricken persona. Miss Marple, however, knew that even the smallest of irregularities would soon reveal themselves when viewed from the right angle. It was only a matter of timing. With the quiet grace of one who had spent a lifetime watching without being noticed, she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and made her way through the village streets. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, casting long shadows against the buildings, and the streets were empty save for a few late-night wanderers heading home from the tavern. As she neared the manor, she saw it, a faint flicker of movement from one of the upstairs windows. It was too subtle to be seen by anyone else, but Miss Marple knew what it meant. The widow was up, and she wasn't alone. For a brief moment, the shutters moved slightly, and Miss Marple could see the silhouette of a figure through the glass. The shape was too familiar to be mistaken. The widow was standing there, her face obscured by the thick veil, but she was talking to someone who, by all accounts, shouldn't be there. Miss Marple's heart raced as she quickly retreated into the shadows of the garden wall, careful not to make a sound. Her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. The figure, a man perhaps, hidden from sight by the thick drapes of the manor's windows. What was it that the widow was hiding? Minutes passed, though they felt like hours as Miss Marple stood motionless, her eyes never leaving the house. Eventually, the figure disappeared from the window, and the room returned to its eerie quiet. There would be no answers tonight, she realized, but this brief glimpse had shown her something crucial. The widow's secret, whatever it might be, was not one she would easily reveal. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the market square, where the regular hum of daily life had resumed. The villagers exchanged pleasantries, unaware of the growing tension that had settled in Miss Marple's chest. She had seen something that couldn't be explained away as mere coincidence. Her mind drifted back to the night before, replaying every detail of the widow's actions. But what had she been doing in that room? And who was the stranger? That evening, Miss Marple returned to the manor, this time with a plan. It wasn't often that she took such drastic steps, but there was something about the widow's presence that felt dangerous. Not in the traditional sense, but in a way that Miss Marple had learned to recognize. A quiet threat, the kind that broods slowly, hiding in the dark corners of everyday life. As she approached the manor under the cover of darkness, Miss Marple moved with deliberate care, keeping to the shadows. The house was silent now, but Miss Marple knew better than to assume that meant everything was safe. She circled the manor once, checking for any sign of movement. When she reached the back door, she noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. It had been firmly closed the last time she passed by. Cautiously, she pushed it open just enough to slip through, the heavy wood creaking beneath her weight. The air inside the house was thick with dust, and a strange stillness filled the space. The manor, which had once been filled with life and laughter, now seemed more like a tomb. It was clear the widow hadn't made much of an effort to restore the place to its former glory. Miss Marple's steps were light, almost imperceptible, as she moved through the dark hallways. Her heart thudded in her chest as she made her way toward the staircase. She had no particular destination in mind, only the need to uncover something, anything, that could explain the widow's erratic behavior. The stairs creaked underfoot as she ascended, the silence broken only by the occasional distant murmur of wind rattling the windows. When she reached the top of the stairs, she paused, her breath shallow as she strained her ears. There, faintly, she could hear the sound of muffled voices from behind one of the closed doors. It was then that she realized she was no longer alone in the house. The widow wasn't the only one hiding something. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the door handle, cold and unfamiliar beneath her touch. She paused again, wondering if this was the right moment, wondering if this could be the piece that completed the puzzle. But before she could turn the knob, she heard footsteps approaching, soft but unmistakable. The widow, it seemed, was coming her way. Chapter 4. The Revelation. Miss Marple quickly stepped back, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and caution. The echo of footsteps grew louder, and she could feel the weight of the moment settling heavily in her chest. It was now or never. If she was going to uncover the truth, it had to be now. The widow, a woman whose carefully crafted silence had guarded so much, was nearing the threshold. In a swift motion, Miss Marple slid into a small alcove beside the staircase, pressing her back against the cold stone wall. She held her breath, the stillness of the house amplifying the sound of her pulse in her ears. Her eyes remained fixed on the door across the hall, the faint light that flickered beneath it, casting long shadows on the floor. The widow's footsteps paused just outside the door, and Miss Marple could feel the tension building in the air, like a storm waiting to break. She couldn't see her, but she could sense her, an instinct Miss Marple had honed over years of quiet observation. The widow, still hiding behind that veil, was a creature of habit, and habit would betray her. The door creaked open with a soft protest, and Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. She dared not make a sound, knowing that the slightest movement could alert the widow to her presence. The widow's figure appeared in the doorway, moving with the same eerie grace Miss Marple had come to associate with her. But it was what happened next that shook Miss Marple to her core. In the dim light of the room, Miss Marple saw something, or rather, someone that she had never expected. The widow wasn't alone. There, sitting at a table, was a man. He was older, with graying hair and a rugged face, his features hidden partially by the shadows. He looked as though he hadn't seen the light of day in years, his eyes hollow, with a weight that was both physical and emotional. The widow spoke softly, her words barely audible, but Miss Marple could make them out, her practiced ear catching each one. "It's time then," the widow said, her voice trembling but firm. "We can't keep running forever. The truth will come out. I know it." The man, his face still obscured, nodded gravely. He reached for a small leather-bound book that lay before him on the table. As his hand brushed over it, Miss Marple caught sight of the inscription on the cover, and her breath caught in her throat. It was the name of the town, the name of St. Mary Mead. The book, though worn and fragile, seemed to hold a significance far greater than its age suggested. "I don't care what happens to me," the man replied, his voice rough like gravel. "But you must be careful. The truth is a dangerous thing to reveal." Miss Marple's mind raced. The widow's secret wasn't just a matter of grief or loss. There was a history here, something that connected the widow to St. Mary Mead in ways no one had suspected. The book, the one that seemed to contain the truth of their past, was key. But what was the truth? What had they been hiding all this time? As Miss Marple's thoughts whirled, the widow stepped closer to the man, her veil swaying as she knelt beside him. For a moment, the room was filled with the soft rustle of fabric, the only sound in the stillness. The tension between them was palpable, and Miss Marple could almost feel the weight of their unspoken words pressing down on her. "What are you hiding?" Miss Marple whispered to herself, though she knew the answer would be far more complicated than she could have imagined. The widow, once a simple figure of sorrow, was now a symbol of something far more dangerous, an enigma wrapped in layers of deception. Miss Marple didn't need to see the man's face to know that this was the moment she had been waiting for. The pieces of the puzzle, were slowly beginning to fall into place, one by one. There was something in that book, something that had been buried for far too long, and it was time for Miss Marple to unearth it. But before she could move, a sudden noise made her freeze. The sound of footsteps, louder now, growing nearer. She quickly ducked lower into the shadows, holding her breath once again. The widow turned sharply, her eyes darting toward the hallway. Miss Marple's heart stopped, knowing that she had been discovered. But to her surprise, the widow didn't call out. She didn't scream or panic. Instead, she stepped back into the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Miss Marple remained still, her mind racing. The truth was closer than ever, but it was now shrouded in even deeper secrecy. Whatever had been revealed in that brief exchange had unsettled the widow, but it had also given Miss Marple the final clue she needed. The widow wasn't just hiding from her past. She was running from something far more dangerous. And Miss Marple knew that if she could uncover the truth behind the book, she would unlock the key to understanding the widow's past and the secrets of St. Mary Mead itself. Chapter 5. The Unmasking. The early morning mist clung to the streets of St. Mary Mead, weaving its way through the quiet village like a forgotten dream. The day was gray, the sky heavy with the weight of an impending storm. Miss Marple walked at her usual pace, each step measured and deliberate, her mind focused on what she had learned. The widow's secret was no longer a distant mystery, but a riddle she was now close to solving. The book, that old worn relic, was key to everything. The answer lay within it. She only had to find it. Miss Marple's steps carried her to the village square, her senses heightened as she watched the villagers begin their day. The familiar faces, the mundane conversations, the comfort of routine, all of it seemed so insignificant now. The village, once a place of serenity, now felt like a stage, the players unaware that the curtain was about to rise on a performance none of them could have imagined. As Miss Marple made her way to the manor, she recalled the words of the widow and the man, their conversation echoing in her mind. The truth is a dangerous thing to reveal. Those words lingered, heavy with meaning. There was something far more sinister at play here than simple grief or loss. This wasn't just a widow mourning a husband. This was something darker, something that had been buried for years, hidden beneath layers of deceit. When she reached the manor, the door was once again slightly ajar. The atmosphere inside the house had changed since the last time she was there. The silence seemed thicker now, almost oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Miss Marple moved carefully, her every step purposeful. She knew this was the moment when the final piece of the puzzle would fall into place. She made her way up the stairs again, this time more confident, more certain of what she would find. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm, as it always did. She reached the door where she had overheard the widow and the man speaking, the door still slightly open. She paused for a moment, listening, but the house was silent now. No voices, no movement. With a deep breath, Miss Marple pushed the door open. The room was as it had been the night before, dimly lit, the shadows stretching across the floor. But there was something new now, something that caught her eye immediately. On the table where the book had lain, a small envelope had been placed. It was unmarked, its edges crisp and clean against the worn wood of the table. Miss Marple approached cautiously, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for the envelope. She knew that this was it, the final clue. She lifted it carefully and opened it. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, its surface covered in faded ink. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as if written in a moment of panic. Miss Marple read the letter silently, her eyes scanning the words quickly but thoroughly. The letter was dated years ago, long before the widow had arrived in St. Mary Mead. It spoke of a scandal, of a betrayal that had shaken the very foundation of the widow's life. The letter's author, who Miss Marple realized was none other than the widow's late husband, described a deal made with a powerful man, a deal that had come with consequences far darker than anyone had imagined. The widow's husband had been involved in something far more dangerous than a mere business venture. He had been mixed up in illegal dealings, shady transactions that had left a trail of ruin behind them. And the man in the manor, he was a part of it. A silent accomplice, perhaps, or a victim, forced into hiding as the consequences of their actions caught up with them. Miss Marple's hands trembled as she folded the letter back into the envelope. She had known there was more to the widow than met the eye, but she had never suspected it was tied to such a deep and dangerous secret. The widow had come to St. Mary Mead not just to mourn, but to escape, a place to bury her past and hide from the consequences of her choices. But the truth could not stay buried forever. The widow had made a mistake in trusting the village's silence, in assuming that her past could remain hidden forever. And now, Miss Marple held the key to her unraveling. With a steady breath, Miss Marple turned and walked out of the room, the weight of the secret pressing down on her. She had uncovered the truth, but it was not without a cost. The widow's life, once wrapped in the comforting layers of grief, was now exposed, stripped bare. And Miss Marple knew that it was only a matter of time before the rest of the village would learn what had truly happened. The widow's mask would fall, and with it, the carefully constructed world she had created. Miss Marple's steps slowed as she reached the bottom of the stairs. She knew what she had to do next. The truth had to be revealed, no matter the consequences. It was time to confront the widow, to face her with the reality of her past. But as Miss Marple stepped outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, the sky opening up as if the heavens themselves were preparing for the storm that was coming. The village of St. Mary Mead, so peaceful and quiet, was about to change forever. The rain fell in heavy sheets, drenching the cobblestones and turning the once serene village square into a labyrinth of puddles. The thunder rumbled softly in the distance, a warning of the storm that was about to break. Miss Marple paused for a moment at the threshold of the manor, her eyes casting one last glance at the quiet, sleepy village. The world around her had been irrevocably changed. The truth she had unearthed would send shock waves through St. Mary Mead, and there was no turning back. The widow, still hiding behind the veil of sorrow and grief, would have to face the consequences of the past she had so carefully buried. Miss Marple knew this was no longer just about revealing a secret. It was about holding the widow accountable for the choices she had made and the lives that had been affected by them. The widow, once just a woman mourning a loss, was now a symbol of a far darker story, one of betrayal, fear, and deception. Miss Marple approached the widow's manor with the calm confidence that only years of quiet observation could provide. The widow's life, it seemed, was as fragile as the veil she wore. Each step Miss Marple took was measured, deliberate. There was no rush, no need to hurry. She had seen this moment coming for years, ever since she had first set eyes on the widow and sensed the weight she carried. The widow had tried to bury her past in St. Mary Mead, but some truths were too heavy to remain hidden forever. When she reached the manor, Miss Marple didn't knock. She simply opened the door, which had been left ajar, as though the widow had been expecting her. The interior of the house was unchanged, still draped in the heavy shadows of a past that refused to let go. The faint scent of dust and old wood filled the air. The widow was standing by the fireplace, her figure cloaked in the darkness, her face once again hidden by the thick veil that had become her trademark. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, both of them aware of the storm raging outside, as if nature itself reflected the tension of the moment. "You've come," the widow's voice was low, tinged with resignation. There was no fear in her tone, only an acceptance of the inevitable. Miss Marple said nothing at first, simply watching the widow, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The way the widow's hands trembled slightly, the way she seemed to shrink back into the shadows as though the truth was too much to bear. "I've found it," Miss Marple said finally, her voice steady. "The letter, the book, it's all here. Your past isn't as far behind you as you think. It's time for you to face it." The widow stiffened at the mention of the book, her eyes flickering toward the table where it had once been. The truth was beginning to settle on her like a weight, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. But even now, as Miss Marple's words rang in the air, the widow did not break. She stood there, unmoving, her veil still hiding the face that had once known peace. "I was hoping it would never come to this," the widow murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I could escape it, disappear into the shadows of this village. But you..." She turned toward Miss Marple. Her eyes, though hidden, seemed to pierce through the veil. "You always see more than you let on, don't you?" Miss Marple gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "One learns a great deal, living quietly among people who think they are invisible." The widow took a step toward her, her movements slow and deliberate, as if each step brought her closer to an unbearable truth. She reached up and, with a trembling hand, lifted the veil that had hidden her from the world. The gesture was quiet, almost tragic, as if she were shedding a skin she had long worn in order to protect herself. When the veil finally fell away, Miss Marple saw the widow's face for the first time. The woman was beautiful in a way that spoke of a past once full of promise, but there was something hardened in her features now. Deep lines of worry and regret marred her face, the evidence of a life lived in constant fear of being found out. Her eyes, once bright, now held only the shadow of grief, the kind that gnawed at the soul and left little room for light. "You've hidden your secrets well," Miss Marple said softly, her voice filled with both pity and understanding. "But secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how deep you bury them." The widow's eyes flickered with something. Was it guilt? Fear? A mixture of both? "What do you want from me, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as though she were afraid to hear the answer. I don't want anything from you, Miss Marple replied, her gaze steady. But the truth will come out one way or another. It's time for you to stop running. The widow looked down, her shoulders sagging with the weight of her past. For a moment, she seemed small, fragile, just a woman who had lost everything and was now facing the consequences. I didn't mean for it to happen this way, the widow whispered, her voice breaking. It wasn't supposed to end like this. But I had no choice. I thought I could keep the past buried. Keep him buried. Miss Marple stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the widow's arm. You can't hide from the past forever, but you can choose to face it, to let it go. There was a long pause as the widow seemed to wrestle with her emotions. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but Miss Marple knew that the time for silence was over. The widow's truth, long hidden behind layers of grief and deception, was finally exposed. And now, there was no escaping it. As the widow stood in the quiet aftermath, Miss Marple could only wonder how this revelation would change the fabric of St. Mary Mead. The village, so serene and untouched by scandal, would never be the same again. And neither would the widow. The veil had fallen, and with it, the last shred of her carefully curated life. But there was one thing Miss Marple knew for certain. The truth, once revealed, would always find its way home. The